my dungeon.
Welcome to Cauldron's Crypt. I'm your host, Master Cauldron. If you're new to the show, we use our combined 30 years of experience to dispel myths, get rid of stereotypes, and answer your questions about BDSM. You can call in at 865-268-4005 to leave your questions or visit the crypt at cauldronscrypt.com. On this episode of The Crypt, we're going to get into consent. But first, I have to welcome my amazing co-host, Fun Size. Hello, Fun Size.
Hello, Cauldron.
How are you today?
I'm all right. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing quite well. I'm eager to get into this topic. It's a long-running issue within our community, and I'm hoping that we can shed a little light onto the subject and possibly clear up some confusion for some people, or we may unmask our own confusions about it. I don't know. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Let me go ahead and hit the rules to love by, as I always do, and then we will jump on into the topic. So, rule number 1, safe, sane, consensual, and informed. Rule number 2, kinky. That's KNKI from the Kinky app, available on all platforms. That stands for knowledge, no intolerance, kindness, and integrity. And finally, number 3, the quote from Mr. Paul Young. Submission is not about authority, and it's not about obedience. It is all about relationships of love and respect. Very important to remember there. All right, so consent. We know it is an incredibly important topic for both you and I. Both of us have experienced violations, so this is going to be interesting. I know that we have planned to do this in 2 parts, but let's go ahead and get into this. So what would be a good firm definition? As longtime listeners know, I love definitions.
Well, for the definition, consent is what a person has knowingly and willingly agreed to a form of participation in. That form and those activities, behaviors, etc. are what consent applies to. Legally, consent is defined as being able to freely give agreement to participate in, usually, a sexual activity. Many states in the U.S. have separate definitions as well, which also specify who is capable of giving consent. For example, a child cannot consent, but different states have different laws as to what determines a child versus adulthood, of course. And then there's also people who are unconscious can't give consent. And for more information about those laws, we've included a link that you can look up where your state is and see what their specific consent laws are as far as the legal part goes.
That is something that people definitely need to check on, is state by state. However, I kind of practice when it comes to most things, as far as age and things like that. I'm 40. I don't need to be playing with somebody that's 18.
Yeah, I'm the same way. I actually just joined the Kinky app this last week, and I've been asked by at least a dozen individuals if I'd play with them, and they're between the ages of 18 and 21, and they're upset when my answer is always, "You are too young for me." For those that don't know, I'm 29, so the youngest person I will do anything with is 25. So I've had to turn people away for that.
At 40, I have about the same rule. At 25, there are
right? Because if they can't rent a car, then
yeah.
It's a thing. You got to be able to rent a car.
Yeah, some would consider that age discrimination, but I consider that safety.
Right. I'm right there with you.
All right. So, as usual, a great definition. That link, I checked that out. So, what do we have to consent to within the context of BDSM? I know there's probably a few different areas that we need to look at. I think activities, behaviors, anything else that you can think of as far as different categories there?
No, but I would say that when it comes to activities, we can definitely split that into 2.
Okay.
Sexual and non-sexual. The sexual includes everything from kissing to full-on intercourse of any and every kind, which also includes the use of inanimate objects for any kind of sexual purposes. And then the non-sexual, what you will consent to as far as impact play, punishments, rewards, etc. You can even choose to consent or not consent to things like writing journals or taking pictures.
Yeah, and journaling is one of the most common things that dominants will have their submissives do. But just because it's common, it doesn't mean that you have to consent to it. I recently heard somebody talking, this probably a month, 2 months ago, at a munch, and they were kind of doing some negotiating, and that was one of the topics that come up, and she was very hardcore against journaling. And in this case, it was kind of strange because she was the dominant and he was the submissive, and he was all about it. And she's like, well, no, because in her experience, she had broke someone's consent in the past with punishing out of the journal. So she didn't want to risk doing that again. So she just finally said, you can journal all you want. I just don't need to know about it. Don't want to see it. We can have verbal communication and check-ins. So it's just another example of people making BDSM their own thing, doing what works for them. And in the time frame, I actually saw them yesterday, and they were quite happy, and they had finished their negotiations and had entered into a full DS relationship. But yeah, it's going to be different for every person. So anyway, behaviors.
Kneeling, honoring, or having any of those behaviors used on you or using those honors. I think it's important to note here that dominants have to give their consent to. And as a dominant, if I have someone that's trying to honor me and I haven't consented to it, it's an issue for me. And I know you feel the same way.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I can appreciate the respect given, but at the same time, if you are not mine, then I just don't feel that it's necessary. And I don't want someone getting the impression that you are mine, because, well, that can just go into all different kinds of issues on its own. But one that we don't have, emotional consent or psychological, to be made to feel a certain way or act in a certain way. I guess the acting, it kind of falls under the behaviors as a psychological effect. But I think that's very important to point out as well, getting into what type of degradation, humiliation for some.
Mind games.
Yeah, mind games. Some people have a serious problem with being praised. I've known several people with that. In fact, I'm actually one of those people. I don't handle compliments very well. It's very humbling to the point of almost being emotionally painful for me, which is kind of odd because I also thrive on those things. Like all of the listener feedback that we get, the messages and emails, and thank you to you and Fun Size so much for what you do and continuing with this and all the information that we've learned. I'm so honored to get those kind of messages, but at the same time, I kind of feel very shy. It's like almost if I don't have a toy in my hand, or if I'm not in the midst of a scene at some points, then there's just a disconnect between me and that extreme confidence that I have within the confines of an actual scene.
I actually have another behavior to add to this as we're discussing it, and I would say financial tributes. For me, that's something that has always made me very uncomfortable. Something you yourself have done to me slightly in the past with my birthday gifts and things like that.
Yeah.
It makes me uncomfortable.
Well, those are presents, not tributes. But yes, I do realize that they make you very uncomfortable.
Yes, and you still do it. But things like that, if you have a person that is, whether they're a financial dominant or not, anything like that can make them extremely uncomfortable and extremely leery because it's something they haven't consented to. So I will note that is also something that you need to pay attention to and get consent for.
Right. Yeah, but I think with you and I and giving birthday presents, and we have
I was using that as an example. I was not saying that you had abusively violated the consent there. I was merely using an example. I want to clarify that. I do not now or ever feel as though I have been abused by Cauldron in any way. That's a formal statement and a very, very true one. Okay?
Thank you. And I was just going to say, I'm still going to continue to do that. So it doesn't matter.
And I'm still going to continue to be uncomfortable and give you compliments that make you uncomfortable. But we know this about each other.
Because that's just how we do.
Yes.
All right. So, in kind of lining out what consent is, the different, a few different types of consent, whether it's sexual, non-sexual activities, behaviors, emotional distress, there's a very obvious question there. And I'm sure I know it's on your mind. And the answer is also very obvious. At least it really should be. But it's something that you and I stand firmly on that we need to discuss. And that is, why is consent so important?
Okay, so I'm going to do this like a conversation because I think that's going to sink into people a bit more. And the conversation that we're going to have is that, say you've got a vanilla couple. They don't sit there and discuss every little thing. They don't go, oh, I'm going to kiss you. I'm going to undress you. This is what we're going to do explicitly. This is how it's going to be done. They don't do that. So why should we? Why should we have to define consent for every action or activity we participate in for our alternative lifestyles?
That's a very good question.
Do you want to go ahead with the answer?
Well,
I know you have it.
For me, that answer would be because we play at the speed of sound, and the level of communication that we have to have because of how we push the limits and how important it is to know every single act that we do is okay, whether it's right now in a scene or in a DS relationship 24/7 or collar on, collar off, whatever the case may be. With pushing those limits, it's important to find out, okay, I've got blanket consent on this. I've got situational consent on this, and this I just don't have consent on, period. And we may or may not consent to revisiting that. But I think a lot of it comes into being able to form trust with the person or people that we're playing with. And without trust, there just can't be any consent. So I think that would be one of the major things. Where would you go with the answer?
I would say that we have to, because of the nature of our relationships, like you said. For me, without consent, there can't be trust. And without trust, there can be no consent. And without both, you can't have a relationship of love and respect. So right there, you've already crossed the line and it's no longer BDSM at that point for me. And then I would have to second and say that we do things within our lifestyles that present risk, which require knowing consent to be able to participate in safely, which includes all forms of safety. And then finally, I would point out a side note for that you can't give knowing consent unless you have a clear and stable mind. So anyone that's unconscious, inebriated, in an altered state of mind like sub or dom space, that's not a time to ask for their consent for any activity because they are in an altered state of mind. They can't give clear consent. And then I'm going to throw this out there. People within the bounds of vanilla relationships should be seeking consent at all times.
I agree. Mental illness, that's another one. And that can be very tricky. As everyone is aware that has listened for some time or been to the website, I worked in the mental health field for 20 years. And which I was in a situation last night where that actually came up. So that can be something very, very tricky to deal with. And you have to manage all of these. Doesn't matter what it is, but you have to be able to manage yourself and your actions with dignity and respect for yourself and others. And if you are doing that, then there's a really good chance, if you know what the definition of dignity and the definition of respect is for yourself and for others, then there's almost zero chance of actually breaking someone's consent intentionally. And I like how you add the vanilla relationship, because that's something that people don't think about very often when we're talking about BDSM. They try to stay away from the vanilla, especially when we're doing a 101 podcast, because that's what they're coming from. And I know that a lot of the newer people that I talk to, they don't even want to really think about a lot of the vanilla relationships except for in a negative light. And they often forget to take the positive things that they've learned in those vanilla relationships and carry them over into BDSM, because they start learning about all of this negotiation and open communication and boundaries and talking. And they think, well, this is so much better. This is how the vanilla should have been. But it kind of causes them to lose sight of some of the positive things that they've learned in previous vanilla relationships. So don't make that mistake. That's a common one that I've seen, especially lately. So be cautious of that. Anything else to add at that point or on that point?
No, but I think we should get into the types of consent violations
Oh, that
because
is,
this is an important one.
yeah, this is a big one. So go ahead and take the lead on this part.
All right, so we really have two types. We have honest mistakes and we have abuse. We've all made honest mistakes at some point, both in and out of the lifestyle. Something as simple as referring to Cauldron as master without his permission can be a violation of his consent. If you're informed of this before addressing him, you could easily make this mistake, if you don't know. But it's when you become aware of this fact and keep doing it that you are personally violating consent, and it's not a mistake.
Yeah, that is an important thing to point out. What other kinds of honest mistakes do you have?
Well, for an example, you could have an established partner and decide to do a scene in which silent communication is needed, but forget hand signals to be set up beforehand and miss a communication opportunity, which can lead to a consent violation. It's a mistake and a dangerous one, but hopefully one that can be overcome. We all have moments like this where things happen and it's a whoopsie moment, but you have to forgive yourself. In one of the ropes and riggers group, a rigger posted just this last week about how his rope bunny had passed out and he immediately took her down, but he had missed the silent hand cues that she was trying to give him because of the positions they were in. So she had passed out, and it was a very dangerous mistake, but he checked on her, he did all the proper aftercare and everything, and she was fine. But of course, he's feeling the negative consequences of that and feeling like he betrayed her consent. It was an honest mistake, but
Yeah.
these things unfortunately do happen with the risk that we take.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up rigging. I think that's probably one of the places where a lot of these honest mistakes happen the most. I know one of our local riggers, who is one of the leaders of our rigging community here, a phenomenal individual, gives workshops, leads a monthly group, and he and his wife, and she's his rope bunny. He tells you all the time, it's not if, it's when the mistake happens. It's going to happen. He's dropped her on her head. I believe she broke her wrist at one point. And this sounds, oh, well, he's just a horrible, abusive person. No, these were actual, just honest mistakes. We do play a dangerous game. And last night, I wrapped somebody with a dragon tail around the side, misstruck, hit just above their right lower cheek, and caught them just around the side, left a huge welt and mark, and which isn't a problem. The problem was the amount of pain to such a sensitive area because you're getting around the side of the body where the kidney is, and I will feel bad about that for the next few weeks, more than likely. Even though she's a longtime player, she is a pain junkie and was okay with it. She knows mistakes can happen, but I feel horrible about it. I really hate when I misstrike, and it's going to happen from time to time. And the worst part about it is that was probably a mistake that I could have avoided because I'd already played somebody really hard and I knew that I was getting a little bit tired, and I ended up calling the scene shortly after that because I was just exhausted. It was very, very heavy play. But nonetheless, it was a mistake that I made. Probably could have avoided it and should have avoided it. But those kinds of things, because I've done it when I was completely fresh too. When the first 10 minutes of playing with somebody after a good night of rest and good food and had no reason. But yeah, these things can happen. So, all right, we've got the honest mistakes out of the way. When it comes to abuse, I think intent is a huge part of that definition of what makes the difference between the two. If you intend to violate the consent of your partner, then you're already an abuser. Mistakes can be made, or mistakes, they're not made with intent. That is only abuse. Fun size?
Yes, it's how the person who has their consent violated, how they feel is the ultimate tell as to whether or not the violation has been a simple mistake or abuse too. I've faced both sides of this myself. When it has been a mistake, I found that I could apologize and be apologized to. Work could be put in so that trust could be repaired or rebuilt and the relationship got better. But when it was abuse, that can happen. The most I could hope for, that anyone can hope for with abuse, is to learn to forgive, even if it's just yourself, and heal enough to find your own peace.
Yeah. And that's a huge conversation on FetLife in local groups as far as what makes abuse or what's the difference. And like you said, with intent and accidents and how the person feels, it's a puzzle. And every situation has different pieces that fit together differently. But quite simply, if your intent is of foul nature, then you're an abuser. If I know that someone does not like single tail whips and I pull out my new 4-foot snake whip, then I am an abuser. So that just plain and simple. You don't do it. You don't, even if it's to scare them with it or whatever, that may cause emotional distress that you don't realize is there. Fun size, you have shared with us an abusive situation in your initial interview. And knowing that, before I ever got out a single tail around you, I'm not just going to pull it out and crack it for intimidation purposes with what you've been through unless we had talked about that beforehand. Otherwise, that's not accidental breaking of consent. That is emotional abuse on my part toward you. All right. So in talking about this, there is one thing, and I mentioned this in several previous episodes, Kinky Cast. It's another podcast that comes out of Nashville from Woody and the Beast. They are absolutely amazing people. They are huge, not just in the Nashville scene or the U.S. scene, but internationally. I think between them, they've got 60 or 70 years of experience. Their show is primarily interview based. In episode 201 that just came out, it is all about abuse. It's the nightmares of BDSM. And there are 6 people telling stories. And you can listen to that and get a really good idea of what we're talking about here as kind of some real life experience besides our own. I want to add as much to this as I can. And if that means going to another podcast because it's not competition, it's all education, please do that. And we'll put the link to that in the show notes. All right. So moving forward, some of the massive issues with consent, I know several that come to mind right off the bat. Where would you like to run with it first?
I'm going to tackle a stereotype first. And this is one that a lot of vanilla people have made about the BDSM lifestyle following the pulp culture catastrophe that was 50 Shades of Grey. And that's that anyone who is part of this lifestyle is being portrayed as violent. Persons who only wish to abuse and violate are victims. I can't tell you how many times I had coworkers, friends, vanilla people I know, they'll see the book or the movie on the shelves and they'll look at me and they go, "That is rape. That is rape, and anyone involved with that in real life is a rapist." To my face, they have said this.
Wow.
Not knowing about me. And it's a big issue and a big stereotype that we are being cast as this kind of people because of abusive icons in the media. And that's just one huge issue. And then the others come from the actual consent problems. And they're problems that I personally would love to abolish and hope that I am in some minute way. And those are silence, oppression, misinformation, and arrogance. Silence comes from a few different places: shame, fear, and denial of what has occurred. And that leads from silence from the victim all the way to the whole of the community. When my consent was violated and I was physically abused to the point of needing to receive immediate medical care, I didn't want to talk about it. I still very rarely do. I was ashamed at what had happened and what I had allowed to happen as far as my mindset went. I was ashamed that I wasn't able to stop the abuse. I was bound. I had consented to everything up until that point. I had been trained to protect myself, and I couldn't take the punishment at that point, and I was harmed, not hurt. Hurt I can deal with. I think anyone who's listened to the show before recognizes the fact that I'm a masochist. I take hurt, but harm is a very powerful issue for me. I mean, after the immediate event, I was in the emergency room. And of course, the police were notified because I had been physically assaulted. which, if you don't know, anytime you go into the emergency room with anything like that, they will be called along with social services, and you will be given the choice to speak to them, but it's pretty much you're pinned between a rock and a hard place when it comes to talking to them, which is where my assault and my silence came into play. In order to talk to them, to break my silence, I had to out my assaulter, knowing that in all likelihood, my community, my local community, would shun me for outing someone. Because a lot of communities don't care what your reasoning is. Anytime you out somebody, you face the consequences of that. So I didn't think I would have any support. I was terrified and violated and ashamed and so alone and so vulnerable. But I had to make the choice to talk about it, to break my silence, to face the fear of what I was going through alone without any support, because I understood that without doing this, I was going to be putting somebody else in my position in the future. And that's an important part of facing abuse, is finding the strength to break your own silence and to push through your own fear. And it's what happens to a lot of victims. It's what a lot of victims will go through during these times. I've since come across several others who will outright deny that they were ever abused. They say that they wanted to submit, so they had no right to say no to something they weren't comfortable with, or they never said the words no or stopped or said a safe word, so their consent couldn't have been violated, despite the fact that they felt abused and pushed beyond limits of what they felt was okay. But here's the huge issue. Consent is not inherent, and that's what makes communication so important.
Thank you again for diving into that. I know it's still a difficult thing. I think you really hit on something there at the end as well, with people that never said no or stop or said a safe word. It's in the submissive's nature to want to please, to want to push themselves. And that causes such a psychological quandary when it comes to facing this. And in some of these cases, because that's not said, I can be quite the laughing sadist, and I really have to watch Percusio's body language and check in with her frequently when we play, because she does enjoy it. She is a masochist, but at the same time, she is also to the core submissive and wants to please. And I could so easily go way too far with her, because there are times when she's not going to give me a 4 or a 5 in a hand signal because of how I'm reacting to what I'm doing. So it's not just looking at her hands, it's also watching her body language and taking a moment to place my hand on her neck and stepping in to talk to her, to kind of make sure that I break my headspace, my laughter, because I'm responsible for her well-being when we play, just as I'm responsible for the well-being of any person that I play with. And that's a big thing that I know for a fact a lot of newer people don't think about. It's not talked about. They're not told. So just because you're laughing or however you respond to your sadist acts and you're not getting a response back that would indicate that you need to stop, you have to be very self-aware. Back when we talked about DOMs and the types of DOMs, talking about the controlled DOM and the two definitions of that, one being someone that is has rules set up by someone else for them to follow, by another Dom for them to follow because they're playing with the other Dom, submissive or bottom. And then my personal favorite definition as it applies to me and trying to be controlled and making sure that I don't push too far, I don't go overboard, stopping and doing that check-in. Because I know for a fact, though it has never happened, I've made sure of that but she would let me go too far if she thought that I was really starting to enter into that top space or dom space to an extreme level, and she just wouldn't want to stop it. She would want me to do that even at her own risk. And I'm grateful for that. I appreciate the level of trust and submission during play that she has. But at the same time, that's something that we have talked about, because I noticed that taking place early on, and it's stopped, in my opinion. She respects that wish of me not to abuse her. And of course, she doesn't want to be abused. But at the same time, I would take that not, if I push myself beyond that point, I wouldn't consider that accidental, because I know the situation. And I know that she would let me push too far. And some people would argue, well, if she would let you do it, then that's not abuse on your part. That's her own fault for not telling you to stop. And people that say that are either or making an excuse for their own abusive nature, or two, they don't understand the mind of a submissive. And I know I get real stern on this point, and that's because it is a very important point for people to understand that if somebody is in that headspace, that subspace, bottom space, then you're the one that's responsible as the top. So don't allow yourself to be fooled by their wanting to please you. That's what they do. That's the submissive nature. That's what I love and respect so much about submissives. But at the same time, that's one of the things that makes the games that we play so dangerous. So I think I've expressed that to the best of my abilities and as thoroughly as possible. So if you are prepared, we can move on.
Yes, when someone breaks their silence about a consent violation, often a community will try to oppress or deny that abuse has ever happened. Whenever we are abused within our community, it's recommended to alert our community leaders. However, what can we do if it's our community leaders who are the abusers? Who can we then turn to? And honestly, too often there's no one. We only have ourselves and the people that we have closest to us, that we have formed real relationships of love and respect, whether they're DS or just friendships, to be our supporters in those times.
Yeah, that makes a very tricky situation, which I've been dealing with lately.
Yes, which I have been kept abreast of.
Yeah.
But there are also known cases of leaders sweeping known violations under the proverbial rug because they're friends with those people who are the abusers, and they're simply choosing not to believe the accusations, and that's sheer arrogance.
Yeah.
If you know abuse is happening and you are just going to sweep it under the rug and blame the victim, you are an abuser yourself, and you should be ashamed.
Very well said.
I think my anger is very much coming across.
Yeah.
Bratty Red often likes to say that I get overprotective of others, and I think this is very much a case of that.
I think it's valid with what you've been through, with what we have both seen. It's absolutely a valid thing. I mean, there is nothing wrong with being upset and letting it shine through when it comes to the abuse of others. Which goes back to the whole reason why I originally started this show, and why when I talked to you, I knew that you had so much to add that I had to have you on here. It is your passion and your care and concern that just drew me to you to begin with, in helping to educate others and in just our personal friendship and adventure that we've been on over the past 8-9 months, however long that we've known each other. So very valid. Let it shine through. People need to understand, and I think that really helps. So you've got a link here in the show notes to a FetLife piece. Would you like to kind of give us a little bit of introduction to what that is, so when they go to it, they'll know what they're getting into?
It's a piece of writing on FetLife, as you said, by Mitchie_monster, called Believe the Victim. And I personally like to thank that user for sharing that. Take a look at it. It really does speak for itself.
And what was the title of that again?
Believe the Victim.
Believe the Victim. Okay. I had looked at it previously, but then work came into play. Technology and cell phones often interrupt my life, so I'm going to have to dive back into that, but I am looking forward to seeing what that's about. You always find the best stuff.
I do a lot of research for each and every show. I'm not going to lie.
Yes,
Because I recognize that I don't know everything. So,
all right. Well, let's move into how to protect ourselves. We talk about vetting nearly every episode. It comes up in some way or another. Huge part of what we can do to protect ourselves from encountering a situation in which our consent or the consent of someone else could be violated. I think one of the big things that we make a mistake on is trusting the word of others, regardless of who they are. It's important to vet those around and make sure that we have been able to develop our own unbiased opinions and do that research. And also, one of the big things that I've noticed personally in vetting people is going to someone that I know that the person that I'm vetting knows and saying, hey, I'm potentially going to play with this person. What do you think about them? Oh, I know them. They've been part of the community, the local community for however long, and let's say a year.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, a year is long enough to really get to know somebody. But if you've never seen them play, and these are questions that the person doing the vetting should be asking, but oftentimes we fall victim to ourselves in the vetting process because we assume that the person that we're asking would go ahead and tell us the answers to these questions. Have we seen them play? Okay, you've known them for a year. Is this only through brief interactions at Munches or online or in person? Have you been at any dark parties where they've been? Do you know of any known violations or any abusive situations that they've been involved in? Have you heard anything that I might need to know? Mental illness, alcoholism, which would actually fall into mental illness, whatever the case may be, medical issues that you've heard of. And some people get, well, that's not my place to say that somebody else is, has epilepsy or just got out of the hospital, a month ago for some kind of medical condition or something of that nature. But those are the things that we need to know in the vetting process. And I've just heard of a case where this took place, and the question was, I'm thinking about playing with this person. What do you know about them? Oh, I've known them for about 9 months. They've been coming to Munches every event, and they're good people. And that was the answer, and the person took that answer and ran with it, didn't go any further as far as the questioning, and ended up in a very, very, very violent situation to the point where there were hand signals, there were safe words, and the only thing that took place when a safe word was called, and I mean not just a yellow, there was red, was the person leaned over into their ear and said, I don't recognize safe words. I don't recognize safe words.
That is never okay.
By the time the 4 hours was up, this person was beaten absolutely bloody, had passed out multiple times, and the top, in this case, actually carried the break open smelling salts with them in their play bag so that they could wake them up. It's one of the most horrific cases that I've heard of in a long time, probably since 2014 when the lady was killed in Clarksville, Tennessee. She was a house slave and killed by her 5 roommates, tied up in the kitchen and beaten, and was unconscious, I think 3 times, and they still continued to beat her with an oxygen tank. One person had some kind of respiratory issues and was on oxygen, and the metal pole that was attached to the O2 tank for the cord to run over off of the bed. And yeah, it was a horrific thing. That is actually a case that there is an update on that episode of Kinky Cast number 201 to listen to if anybody's interested in that. It's the final person gives an update on what happened with her. I've been following that since 2014. Absolutely horrific case of abuse, and very intentional, though they all pled not guilty. And the only good part of that entire court case was the judge, because they pled innocence due to consensual BDSM, and the judge in that case said, no, I know BDSM. This was abuse. This was murder. And so there was actually a public recognition by a judge knowing the difference and not turning the case. And that was pretty much all that was allowed to be said about it, not allowing the case to turn into a media witch hunt for those in the lifestyle that do things correctly. But yeah, I know that's an extreme case, both of those, but these are things that we have to watch out for. We never know. We never know. So do your vetting correctly. Trust your instincts, though we all have feelings and instincts. If you're naturally getting red flags, chances are there's a problem there. Be aware of the people and situations that set them off. But the problem with that is, look at people like, if you're doing pickup play or things of that nature, like Ted Bundy, one of the most charismatic people, apparently, according to all the things that I've watched about him. And we all know the name because he was a serial killer. So do vetting the correct way. Ask all the right questions. Fun Size, do you have anything to add to protecting yourself? I'm sure that you do.
Don't be afraid to say no. If something makes you uncomfortable, no matter how little a thing may seem, you can and should say no. You have your limits and boundaries to uphold and communicate. And that actually brings us to the end of this two-parter, because our next subject is, in fact, boundaries.
Certainly. So in the housekeeping, a final note or two or three. I'd like to thank our executive producer, Jeremiah, our senior producer, Matt, producer, Missy Lynn, and our junior producers, K2SO, Irish Mountain Dragon, Fun Size's husband, thank you very much, and the Accidental Trucker. If you would like to become one of our show producers, go to our website, cauldronscrypt.com, click on the Support Me tab, and you can get that information. Second, I'd like to thank BDSM Contracts for their donation of their beautiful 25-page soft and hardbound MS and DS contracts. We don't receive any financial help from BDSMcontracts.org. However, they do donate these wonderful contracts for us to do giveaways with. And if you go to their website, you like what you see, you want to place an order, use the coupon code Cauldron20, that's Cauldron20, and you'll receive a 20% discount on all purchases. And finally, I'd like to thank WhippingStripes.com, my personal maker of leather and paracord impact toys. They do a phenomenal job. Again, not a sponsor of the show. I just use them. I love them. Amazing people. Next week on The Crypt, as Fun Size said, we're going to continue the conversation. It's going to be mainly getting into boundaries. You cannot talk about consent without discussing boundaries. In the meantime, go to cauldronscrypt.com for show notes, how to subscribe information, and the link to our FetLife group so you can take part in the conversation and be eligible for giveaways. While you're there, click on the Support Us tab to become a Patreon show producer. All right, that's going to wrap it up. Until next week, thank you so much for listening. This has been Master Cauldron and Fun Size for cauldronscrypt.com. Unearth the truth.